Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Chris May. Washington is the budget battle right now. The week ended with yet another deadline to pass another short-term spending plan. But Congress and President Obama are also debating the nation's long-term debt and deficit. Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey plays a key role as a member of the Senate Budget Committee. He was elected to the Senate just last November. He previously served 3 terms in the House from 1999 until 2005. Senator, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Good to see you. You have been back in Washington now just a couple of months, but already you have assumed a lead role in your party, especially when it comes to the issue of raising the debt ceiling. The figure right now is $14.3 trillion. We're about to hit that sometime soon, maybe in the next couple of months. Are you prepared to vote against raising the debt ceiling without some significant spending cuts coming along with it?
Let me provide a little bit of context here. We are running unprecedented deficits. We are spending staggering amounts of money. The government's borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar. We're spending all kinds of money that we don't have. And you're right, we're about to crash into the legal limit on how much the federal government can borrow. My view is the most irresponsible thing we could do is to just raise that debt limit and continue spending as usual. We've got to get this under control. So I've argued that we need some structural reforms, some process reforms, a straitjacket, if you will, that will force the government to live within its means. I'd like to see a balanced budget amendment. I'd like to see statutory spending limits on the part of the federal government. Actually, I'd like to see both, but we need some combination, some mechanism that'll allow us to get spending under control. And I won't vote for the debt limit increase unless we have something that's going to prevent us from getting into this spot again.
You know what Democrats say about that, though? They say that failing to raise the debt ceiling is the equivalent of the United States defaulting on its obligations. Even Speaker Boehner has said that it would, quote, send our economy into a tailspin.
Well,
are you willing to take that risk? Is that true?
Well, it's factually not the case. Okay, if the government reaches its debt limit and can't borrow anymore, 70% of everything the government's planning to spend next year is going to come in the form of tax revenue. Only 6% of expenditures are necessary to stay current on our debt service. So we can avoid a default. We can fund the essential services, but I'm not suggesting that this is a long-term solution. What I'm suggesting is the president ought to sit down with us, and it needs to be a bipartisan agreement where we get some kind of constraints. Because look at where we are. We're running budget deficits of $1.6 trillion. The total amount of debt is growing astronomically. This is not sustainable. You know, I used to worry about the impact it would have on our kids and our grandkids. I think the problem is much more immediate than that, and we can't just keep kicking this can down the road.
The 2010 election, which took you back to the Senate, was largely about the debt, the deficit, government spending in general. The battle that's going on in Washington right now, who's winning that battle at this point?
Well, you know, nobody's winning until we get a resolution to this. And these series of short-term funding mechanisms, this is no way to run the government. You know, the Defense Department can't plan and doesn't have the permanent legislation it needs to advance their programs. It's very disruptive. Nobody knows what what the next policy is going to be. What we need to do is resolve this, get this year's funding done, get that behind us, and build a budget for next year that will live within our means, that will start us back on a path towards balanced budget and allow us to have the economic growth that we need. Here, that's the most important thing. There's no way we can have the economic recovery and the job creation we need until Washington gets its spending under control. And so it's just vitally important that we do this now.
You mentioned the short-term resolutions that have been passed. There has been some rather substantial budget cutting in those short terms.
That's right.
But if we're talking about long-term, the two sides are still about, what, $60 billion apart. How do you bridge that gap at this point?
Well, even for the remainder of this fiscal year, the two sides are over $50 billion apart. You know, I think we need to see a little bit of movement. The president really has disappointed me in that he hasn't provided the kind of leadership that he can. Some on the other side, you know, there were quite a number of Democrats that voted against the Democratic alternative that had virtually no spending cuts. So I think there's an increasing awareness that we've got to make some cuts to spending, and we've got to do it now. You know, promises about doing it someday in the future, that just doesn't cut it anymore.
Well, when it comes to the president's 2012 budget, I know you've been critical of his failure to really take on any kind of entitlement reform. Are Republicans really going to be willing to take on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, make substantial changes in those programs that would, lead to the kind of budget cutting you're talking about?
Well, I think some are. I, for instance, have said for a long time now that our Medicaid is completely unsustainable. It's the fastest growing of these big programs. It's growing at a completely unsustainable rate, both for the federal government and state governments. It's driving a lot of the problems we're facing. And partly it's because we've got this one-size-fits-all, Washington knows best program. So I've argued that we ought to take the funding for Medicaid, block grant it to the states. Just give the money to turn it over to the state governments and say, hey, you figure out how to administer this program. It's basically providing health care for poor people, and we all acknowledge there's a need for that. But what in the world makes us think that Washington has all the answers? Well, clearly we don't. We're running an unsustainable program. So I'd like to have 50 governors and 50 state legislators figuring out a better way to deliver these health care services in a sustainable and affordable way. You know, welfare reform began at the states, and it worked so well in some states that it was adopted nationally. I don't see why we can't follow that model for Medicaid as well.
Social Security a little trickier, though. Even if there are potential benefits to reforming these programs, and there could be huge potential benefits, politically, isn't this a difficult step for the Republicans to take? Isn't it a bit of a trap, especially moving toward 2012?
Well, there definitely is a school of thought that says the reason the president's not providing any leadership is he wants Republicans to step out and then allow them to take all kinds of fire, and it's all this complicated political maneuvering. You know what? I think voters want us to address the serious problems. I talked about the reforms I think we need for Social Security, which, by the way, would have no effect at all on today's retirees or people who are close to retirement, but would make some voluntary changes in the program for young workers. I think voters want us to address this, and they will consider it irresponsible if we just duck in the weeds and decide that, well, this is too politically risky, so I'm not going to go there. I think that would be very irresponsible.
The fight over collective bargaining for public workers in Wisconsin has attracted a lot of attention to that issue of late. You signed on in the Senate as a co-sponsor to a national right-to-work bill. Your opponents have called that an assault on unions. How do you respond to that, and what would be the practical effect of that?
It's not an assault on unions. My dad spent his entire working life as a union member. I've got two brothers-in-law who are both members of the IBEW, and I think unions play an important and legitimate role, but I don't think anybody ought to be forced to join a union and pay dues as a condition of having a job. So that's my own view on this. You know, the different states are going to address this differently. Virtually every state, not every state, but most states have serious budget problems, and so naturally a big segment of every state budget is the public sector workers, the public sector unions that are on the payroll. But I think the individual states are going to have to figure out how to deal with this separately.
What was your take on how Governor Walker handled his situation in Wisconsin?
I'm not very close to the Wisconsin budget situation. That was his problem, and you know, I'll leave it to the folks in Wisconsin to sort that out.
Okay, let's talk foreign affairs in our last few minutes. Is there a role for the United States to play militarily in the unrest in Libya right now?
I'm not prepared to advocate U.S. military force in Libya right now. There are very many unanswered questions about what would the purpose be, when would we leave, what would we measure as a success, what would we do if and when Americans start being killed, innocent civilians inevitably become casualties. I think there are too many unanswered questions right now for us to commit forces to Libya.
There's been so much unrest in the Middle East and in North Africa, from Egypt to Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. How would you grade the administration in how they've handled these world events?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think there have been some inconsistencies. For instance, a year or so ago, year and a half ago, when the revolutionary movement was taken to the streets in Iran, you have in Iran a terrible government, extremely hostile to the United States, hostile to their own people, a brutal regime that is a complete disaster, and yet the administration was silent when some support for the demonstrators might have led to constructive change. And then, more recently, we've seen a very different approach in other countries, including some where the governments have been much more cooperative with the United States. So I think there's been a little bit of an inconsistency, but let's face it, it's a very difficult situation. It's very volatile. In many cases, we don't know much about these opposition groups, and they're not well defined, and they don't have a central leadership. So it's a tough set of circumstances.
Let me ask you finally, there's been some concern in some corners over the treatment of the Army officer who's been accused of leaking classified U.S. information to WikiLeaks, the website. His name is Bradley Manning. He's at Quantico right now. He's been kept in isolation for 23 hours a day. At times, he's been forced to spend time naked. A Pentagon spokesman criticized the administration over this. He was reportedly pushed from his job over the weekend. I'm wondering if you have concerns at all with the conditions in which Private Bradley Manning is being held.
Well, let's find out what the real story is first. I think that was a State Department official who made some comments and decided to resign. And it's entirely possible that some of the unusual circumstances were designed, as I think they are often intended, to deal with people who might be risks for suicide. So I think we don't necessarily know all the circumstances yet.
Okay. All right, very well. Very good. Thank you,
right,
Senator, so much for being with us. Good to see you as always.